To Israel now, where government proposals to overhaul the legal system have sparked major protests, with some calling the proposals a threat to democracy. Supporters say the plans, which reduce the influence of the Supreme Court and allow political influence in selecting court justices, are the will of the people, while others have grave concerns about the rule of law and minority rights in Israel.
It's one of the many protests happening across Israel. This time, Israeli army veterans and reservists have invited the public to demonstrate against the government's plans to change the legal system. Across the street from Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's office, Shikma Bressler, a physicist, is addressing the rally. The Israeli scientist worries that Israel's democracy is in danger.
The new government trying to impose laws such that the government will be supreme to basically everything, including justice. So we are here to make sure that such legislation will never pass. It will take us down the road that Hungary and Poland and Turkey and Iran went before us. We just want to make sure that this is not happening here as well.
Just a few hundred meters away at Israel's Knesset, the far-right government is pushing through with its plans to drastically curb the powers of the nation's Supreme Court. Parts of the legislation have already passed the first reading in Parliament. Simcha Rothman from the far-right religious Zionist Party is one of the main architects of the judicial reform. He says voters have given the government a mandate to go ahead with the controversial overhaul.
In November 1st, a lot of people went out of their homes and voted. And they voted on exactly this issue. So to listen to there is a lot of people, but it is a small minority in Israel that says that this reform is not good for them. We have basically a court that is unbalanced and unchecked, unlike the other entities in the government, which are checked and balanced. So we need to introduce checks and balances to the Israeli system.
But opponents disagree. They say the overhaul will give the government unchecked power and override Israeli judiciary's independence. There's no constitution in the State of Israel and no declaration of human rights. We do not have two houses of parliament. We do not have term limits for the prime minister. That's why, in terms of checks and balances, many times we lean on the High Court's decisions. This law makes it impossible for the Supreme Court to oversee the Knesset and the government's actions. Another protest, this time in front of the Prime Minister's residence in Jerusalem. After weeks of demonstrations, people here are angry that their voices are not being heard and legislation is being pushed through.
I'm here because things are getting really radical in the country. We feel that we are not good enough people, citizens. I would say that a bunch of extremists just took over the parliament and they just want to pass their own laws. They don't care about us. They don't care about the public.
We'll just keep coming here and we'll say what we have to say. We'll try in not a violent way, but I mean, we have nothing else to do and we need to fight for our country.
Despite efforts by Israeli President Isaac Herzog and others, a meaningful dialogue on the issue has yet to materialize. The government insists the reforms are essential and doesn't seem to be backing down.
And we're joined now by DW's correspondent in Jerusalem, Rebecca Ritters. Rebecca, protesters are calling today a day of disruption. Can you tell us more about what's happening in Israel today?
That's right. They're going one step further. In fact, Anya, they're calling this a day of resistance against dictatorships. They're pretty strong words there. We saw a similar day last week on Wednesday, and some viewers will remember that those protests in Tel Aviv actually got pretty violent, with protesters scuffling with police. Today, we're expecting more, definitely more protest convoys. We're already seeing some protesters blocking the highway between Tel Aviv and the north. We're expecting rallies. at different locations. And this evening, we're also expecting a protest outside the house of the Justice Minister. Now, today, there's also expected to be a massive disruption around Ben Gurion Airport between Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. That is an attempt to try and stop Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu from getting to the airport. He is due to take off today on an official visit to Italy. That trip already mired in disruption when pilots from the national carrier said that they refused to fly him. That's obviously now been sorted out. He will apparently be taking off if he can make it to the airport. Other things are expected, as I said, that there's already protests blocking the highway, and we're already seeing a small protest happening outside Benjamin Netanyahu's house as well. Now, protest organisers saying these initial events that they've announced are just the beginning and that they've promised many surprises. So it's a pretty big day ahead here.
OK, so these are obviously not just ordinary protests. They're really going for maximum disruption. And they've been taking place for several weeks now. I believe this isn't the first day of disruption. Is there any sign at all that the government is listening, taking note?
Well, you're quite right that these have been ongoing. They have not just been continuing, but gaining pace. They began in early January. We're now about 2.5 months in, and they began as protests largely in Tel Aviv. Then they spread to other cities around the country. Then they started taking place not just on Saturday evenings, which doesn't cause as much disruption, but during the week. We saw some on Monday, not Monday, but a few Mondays ago, we saw some here in Jerusalem, a huge protest outside the Supreme Court and the Knesset as some of the initial bills were being passed or voted on in the Knesset. So they're really gathering pace. They've quickly spread across the country. Now, they were first dismissed by the government as sort of leftist attempts to try and disrupt things, that these were people who didn't vote for the government that were, sore losers, if you will. But now we're seeing the more people taking part. We're seeing people from all across the political spectrum. We're seeing now, as you heard in that piece, and probably most shockingly for Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and the government, but actual reservists from the military. We know that the Israel has a really strong military. Everyone is conscripted to do military service after high school, and then you have a lot of people in reserve for if the country of course, needs to be defended. Now, many of those reservists saying that if these bills go through, they will not defend the country if the country goes to war. That's quite alarming. We had Benjamin Netanyahu this week saying that a refusal to serve threatens the foundation of our existence, and that there is room for protest, but there is no room for refusing service. So definitely ruffling feathers. There are signs, you heard a little bit of it there in the report, that there's a compromise trying to be found. The President, Isaac Herzog, working hard at a compromise document that can be agreed to on both sides. Whether or not that's going to be successful, there are words that Netanyahu might be interested in taking a compromise, but others in his party or his coalition rather, perhaps not so keen. So if that goes through, if the compromise gets agreed on, then we may see things die down. If not, then who knows where this is going to go, Anya.
All right, we'll be watching closely. Rebecca Ritters in Jerusalem. Thanks you so much.